Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View. Our guest this week is Russ Beaton, a retired professor of economics from Willamette University, and welcome to the show, Russ.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you is because we kind of met at the homeless forum that was held a while back.
Right.
And you also subsequently talked at one of the Salem Progressive Film Series talking about economics, and I thought you had a real good take on kind of how we got to there and where we are today. And you know, because I really don't think the economy is functioning for most folks that work for a living. And so I thought maybe you could kind of share your ideas about what has been going on and maybe what we can do about it.
Well, I have to agree with you. I don't think the economy is working at all well for what we've called the middle class in the United States. What's been going on for the last 30 years, and we can attack this with a lot of different ways, is basically rapidly growing inequality. And that is inequality of wealth as well as inequality of income. And
that is a result, at least from what I've observed, as a result of actual policies that were put into place, actual laws that kind of reduced how much the rich were paying and kind of collapsed the levels. You know, I think right now we have like 3 levels of taxation on income at the federal level, and I believe there used to be like 5 or more.
Well, not only that, the levels are much higher back then as well. I mean,
most of the time it was in the 70% range.
Well, yes, and the heyday of American capitalism, insofar as we have had a healthy middle class, is looked to start in the 50s, late 40s, immediately after the post-war era, and late 40s, early 50s, and 60s. So the 50s and 60s, when you look at the data, are the high point of middle class health. And people don't realize it, but the top tax rate in the 50s was 91%.
Right.
And now the wealthy cry that it's way too high to destroy incentives, and it's 36.
and also part of the problem to me is the fact that the way that income is distributed in this country does go to the top. So they're able to buy access to the media, basically access to Congress, who then write the laws and kind of institute their position into kind of a fixed position in the economy.
Well, I think that's right. And when you get so much money, I believe that your incentives tend to switch from getting more to making sure you protect what you have. And after a while, you have all the levers of power. And so controlling the political system becomes as important as continuing control of the economic system.
And that leads to other problems as far as democracy is concerned.
Of course.
Because then the majority don't get a real say. And you know, my view is that both political parties have been bought out, so that it's working people don't have a political party to, you know, counteract that. And I mean, but that's my view. Right.
Well, I agree with that view.
Oh, okay.
And one factor has been that we've become such a media-centered culture, and with television and advertising dominating everything, that running a political campaign has become a very expensive operation. And I think Clinton, as a representative, as a new Democrat, realized that. I mean, very smart politician, Bill Clinton, obviously. And in effect, the Democratic Party, if you want to put it bluntly, sold out to corporations to simply get into power and hopefully stay there. So it makes both parties pretty much beholden to
the same folks.
To the same folks.
Yeah.
Right.
So that kind of lays out how it came into place. I mean, because I think what happened is during the 30s, when we had a huge depression going on, we kind of changed how we did things. We got Social Security.
Oh, absolutely.
And what do you call it? The WWW, so that people could
the
get
Works Projects Administration, the CCC, all the New Deal,
right.
the New Deal institutions.
And that
Yes.
helped bring the economy back. And one of the criticisms is they didn't actually pump enough money into those programs. But then when the war came up, World War II came up, then lots of money was going into the federal government to be spent on things.
This is a great arguing point within economics, Ken, within the discipline of economics, because we now, you can't read the newspapers without seeing something about the macroeconomy, the national economy. There was no such thing as macroeconomics prior to the 30s. And the macroeconomics as a field in economics was ushered in with John Maynard Keynes in 1936, published his tome, his book, and it basically had an agenda of saving capitalism, because the doldrums of the 30s really cast great doubt on whether a market economy could effectively regulate itself and pull itself out of depressions or recessions.
And there have been several serious recessions here in the United
absolutely.
States. I think they were, my recollection is they were about every 30 years or so.
Right.
And there was some serious recession, I believe, in the late 1870s.
1873, right.
Through 1890 or so.
You passed the test.
Oh, okay. But that period was a very stagnant period.
Oh, absolutely.
And there was a lot of wealth up at the top again.
Interestingly, and it was in the 1870s. I mean, the particular date is 1873. The depths of it. Curiously, a few years post-war, post-Civil War in this case, and that is the very heart of the rise of the robber baron era.
Right.
The basically the Industrial Revolution of the United States, which occurs roughly 100 years after the original Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And that's when the rise of the John D. Rockefellers and Carnegies and the steel and railroad and oil, turned out to be oil barons, began in earnest. And there was a rapidly growing inequality at that time too, culminating in the early 1900s.
And it was also, like you were talking about saving, John Maynard Keynes, kind of, his idea was to save capitalism, because it really was under threat, because people saw that this wasn't working for a huge majority of the population.
Right.
And so there was almost revolution in the air.
Oh, indeed. And a great deal, there had been a great deal written in economics on business cycle theory. So it was pretty well recognized that capitalism was subject to a boom and bust cycle. Now, the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was basically to create an elastic currency. That's the buzzword that the economics texts like. And because the impression was, well, we have these panics, we have these ups and these downs in the business cycle, and very often, almost every time, if you studied the cycles that we'd been through, there'd been a boom period and then a financial crunch and a bust. So the assumption was, if the money supply were simply allowed to expand commensurate with the real sector, jobs and capital investment and all that, then everything would be fine. But we've appeared to run out of money in a boom, and so the Federal Reserve was supposed to be able to help rectify that. Now that gets us back to the 30s,
right,
as you say, and when you look back at the time, the Federal Reserve could have done a lot more in the 30s. But it was a new tool that we'd never really used up to that time. We didn't have any idea what compensatory financing look like, which is what John Maynard Keynes proposed. In other words, he said, in a boom period, tax at a surplus, so you pull purchasing power out of the economy, and in a bust, in the trough of the business cycle, then you deficit finance and pump money into the economy. And this was supposed to smooth out the rises and the falls in the business cycle. So Keynes's goal was to give governments a tool to control the private sector economy. Up to that time, we had worked with the myth, still around today. Just watch a presidential election if you don't believe it. A myth that the private market economy should be left alone whenever possible, and good things happen. When government interferes, it's all to the worse. Now, we never, this is pretty much the feeling of the discipline of economics, we never would have deficit financed to the extent that we did in order to control the economy had World War II not come along. And World War II, as a political crisis, forces you to deficit finance to fund the war, and lo and behold, we pulled the economy out of a recession with a vengeance.
And there was some concern after World War II that it would lead to another recession because you didn't have all that spending.
Right.
And so what did they do to kind of prevent that?
Well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, they invented the Cold War.
Oh, so now you can take care of it by financing military procurement.
And there are good arguments that we never went off the war economy, in effect.
Yeah.
Now, you had the GI Bill,
right,
and you had a lot more favorable, stemming from the Wagner Act in 1935, a lot more favorable legislation with regard to unions, and then the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 tried to say maybe we've gone a little too far with allowing unions free rein.
Yeah, well, it's curious because my father graduated, through the GI Bill. He was basically the first man, male in his family to ever graduate or even go to college. And he got, a degree in engineering, and his first job was for Boeing, making like the B-47,
My father
B-52.
worked for Lockheed.
Yeah, well, he ended up working there later. But the fact is what you're saying is the military spending is what got him that job, because he wasn't getting engineering jobs elsewhere.
However, the GI Bill got him his education.
Right,
Yeah.
that he could take advantage of that. But and that created a much more intelligent workforce than what they had before
Absolutely.
the war, having all these people be able to go to college.
Right. Following the war, there was a perfect storm of situations that really buoyed up the U.S. economy for quite a while. We were the only unwrecked major economy after the war. We had tremendous oil reserves then. We were the biggest oil exporter in the world. So our balance, and we were the biggest exporter of goods and services as Europe rebuilt, and the Japanese and the German economies that we had wrecked gradually came back in. But so we had favorable balance of payments. We could export all over the world. As of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was the world currency, which has come to be a hugely important factor nowadays as well, and one that the powers that be in our country are deathly afraid might change. Because if you're importing oil, I don't care if you're importing it, if you're some other country importing it from some Middle East country, you usually do that trade in dollars. And you need to hold dollars to do that. And if the dollar were not the world reserve currency, especially the currency for energy trade, our economy would be
suffering as a result.
Yeah, the massive trade imbalance that we have is offset by the balance of payments. The money comes back into the U.S. as a result of being the world reserve currency.
And is that under threat today? And where's that threat coming from? Is it because of the instability of our government systems?
Well, again, we could get into all kinds of conspiracy theories, but I read an article by a very well-qualified international economist arguing that much of the reason for the Iraq War was that Saddam Hussein was threatening to make the euro the currency for oil trade, and we couldn't have that. Again, this article went through a complete monetary prognosis of what would happen to the U.S. economy. We'd have an immediate devaluation of the dollar in the 25 to 40% range. We couldn't afford to keep military bases in over 100 countries in the world. And frankly, our days would be numbered as a world power. I mean, this was the hard-nosed economic analysis that came out.
Yeah, because I guess I see it as part of, it's not so much that the United States imports oil from Iraq or Iran or countries in the Middle East.
Right.
It's that we have control of those, so that
Yes.
the control flows through the United States if Europe or someone else wants that petroleum.
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of what you're talking about as the impetus for the war with Iraq, and also, in my view, is the why we keep going after Iran. You know,
Well,
or at
to
least
be
making
sure.
threats and saying they can't do this or they can't do that.
We perceive that we need to stabilize the entire Middle East.
In our
effect.
favor.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
When you say stable, yes.
Right.
It's our definition of stable.
Now, my understanding too is that basically wages have been flat since about 1973 or so.
Yeah, mid-70s. Certainly
And-
the data show up. Distinctly, finally, in 1979.
And what is the cause for that? Because you know,
Well-
I've read different things, but you know, nothing kind of satisfies me on that score.
There isn't one cause, but and indeed any explanation that that is satisfactory and comprehensive would be a complete cultural, economic, cultural, social explanation. I will give you one,
Okay.
and you see what you think of it.
All right.
And you can poke holes in it if you'd like. The post-war economy was healthy, and economists look back now at the 25 years, roughly starting 1947 to 73. They look back at that roughly 25-year period as the absolute high point of American capitalism, and labor economists call it the picket fence era, because the income distribution graph, when you look at the lowest 20%, the next 20%, the quintiles,
Right.
up to the highest 20%, and then the highest 20% of the income distribution are usually broken down, highest 10, highest 5, highest 1. I saw an article yesterday, 85 people in the world own half the wealth.
Of the world.
Yeah. And how's that look for distribution purposes? Yes. Well, the other 303.5 million people, the bottom half, own exactly the same. But what happened in that time period is, this is where I think the discipline of economics is making a mistake, quite honestly. I am not a typical economist insofar as my interpretation of all this data is concerned. Economists say, well, the picket fence era, where the bottom 20% are gaining real income throughout their career, just like the next 20%, or whatever, up to the top 20%. And every one of those quintiles for a period of time in the 50s was showing between a 2 and a 2.5% real income gain per year throughout their career. Meaning, the American dream is alive and well.
Right.
Okay? That even if you're down in the income distribution somewhere, you're not very wealthy, you can afford to own a home, maybe send your kids to school, have a vacation now and then, whatever the American dream means to
Right.
you. Now, what the discipline of economics fails to realize, in my opinion, is that era was not capitalism at work. That was a rigged economy that was still a New Deal economy. It was a regulated economy.
Right.
And it was the economy we had to regulate for purposes of the war. You gave the best example, probably, and that's the GI Bill. Social Security came in and all that. Now it's an enemy of some, you see. Well, my position is the inequality we're getting right now is what capitalism as usual will give you.
Right.
And that economy and the period we look back upon as the high point of American capitalism was really an unnatural situation, one we had created out of necessity.
Yeah, and I realized in the late 70s that there was a lot of talk about deregulation.
Yes.
And I know that for a while I was associated with Greyhound buses, and the drivers that were around in the 80s are still furious about deregulation because it
Absolutely.
basically killed Greyhound and a bunch of other industries.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the notable one was air controllers
Right.
under Reagan.
But the fact is that workers then lost leverage for increasing their income.
Right.
And this has led to an even worse situation today where workers basically have to beg for jobs. And we see communities doing this where they go out and they offer all sorts of tax incentives or tax breaks to companies to move into our neighborhood, steal it from somebody else so that they'll locate here.
It's an absolute suicidal race to the bottom, in my opinion.
And I guess, I've always been considered somewhat radical, but I felt like when they were closing down steel mills in West Virginia and Ohio and like that, and then shipping them elsewhere, like overseas and like that, I thought the communities should step in and declare eminent domain and take over those factories and the equipment in there and set up something for the community to run, because they were still making profits.
I think we've got an image in this country that the worker is powerless. And
Yes.
right. And if you are a big business capitalist, in the history of labor movement, I mean, it's a long and tormented history in this country. That is, in its broad sense, all that is the workforce asking for more input into the way corporations or businesses are run and are organized, and the owners resisting that input. Now, if you think about it, of course, an unorganized or worker, that is a non-unionized workforce, it's you, one worker, versus the big boy that controls the entire operation. Well, it's an uneven playing field, by definition. Now, so we get a union movement. What happens? Big business resists giving away the power, because they're in charge. Why would they want it any other way? And as you said very much earlier, they control the media. They control all the mouthpieces. They control the rhetoric that becomes the mythology that the culture deals with, and therefore the union movement gets branded as communist, leftist, anti-capitalist, whatever. And in my opinion, it should be exactly the opposite. The union movement would really save capitalism.
Yeah.
Because if you give continued power and continued growing inequality to business over time, there's one word where you end up, and that's fascism.
Yeah, and
hate to introduce that ugly term.
Not only that, but like I've worked in corporate America, most all of my adult life.
Sure.
And there's this kind of myth that the people up at the top really know what they're doing.
Right.
And I just want to say, as a worker in that environment, that's usually not the case at all. They're usually the least informed people in the company. And now, I worked in data processing most of my life, and they would call on us techie types to tell them about technology. They didn't understand.
No.
And they didn't sometimes realize the benefits or the drawbacks about doing certain things. And if it got too complicated, they just throw up their hands and say, well, never mind, we won't do that. We'll just keep doing what we're doing.
Right.
And so that's been my experience. And I've seen it time after time.
Well, there's a pretty real argument that the top person, and it might be the top people, is kind of effectively insulated from real news from down in the organization. I mean, think about it. They're going to be surrounded by yes people.
Yes.
They're going to be surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear. And you know, it's human nature. If you fear losing your job, if you don't tell the boss what he wants to hear, well, that's what you do.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
that was quite often.
I do think there's a whole lot of organization theory that supports this, that the information doesn't trickle up very
Yeah,
well.
and that's quite
within
often
the
what I
big
saw. And
bureaucracies.
usually I was one of the big mouths that told my bosses information they didn't want to hear. And but you know, some of those people did respect what I was telling them because they realized they would be making mistakes if they didn't.
Mhm.
So, you know, after a while that you build up a certain reputation and they'll listen. But I mean, that took a long time to establish that.
Having some trust.
Yeah.
And it depends on personalities of the people in the hierarchy,
Yes,
I
it
would
does.
presume. Yeah.
So where do we go from here? How can we, I know we only have a few minutes left, but is there some way that we can kind of regain this? Or do you think we're fighting a losing battle here at this
Well-
point? And we have to have a major economic crisis before we can do something again?
Well, basically, I don't have a lot of faith that we are on the right track to rectifying the system structurally.
Okay.
Now, in part, it's because Einstein had something to say about this. His definition of insanity is keeping doing the same old thing, expecting different results. We are turning the control of the economy right back to the people who ruined it.
Well, yes, in this
I mean,
last financial crisis,
right.
that's what we had. Wall
Wall
Street kind of
Street,
collapsed
right.
the economy, and we,
And there's superficial regulation of Wall Street, but the same stuff's going on that was going on before. We, incidentally, everybody decries all the jobs going to China, for instance, and sort of blames the manufacturing type corporations, you know, whether it's a big oil or General Electric or Nike or whatever.
Right.
The manufacturing employers for creating this nasty globalization situation. The control of our economy, over us and our economy, of those corporations, it pales by comparison of the control of the big financial corporations on Wall Street, the Goldman Sachs and Citibanks and those kinds of people.
Well, yeah, because
they can rig the entire world economy.
Because like Walmart will tell companies that they need to move to China to
Sure.
make stuff they can sell at Walmart.
Sure.
And, you know, maybe we need to have you come back and we can talk about this some more. Because I think there's a real need to discuss economics at a personal level that most people can then understand. And
Well, I'd love to do that.
Okay.
And I haven't even gotten to my theory of how it went bad in the 70s.
okay, well, we'll have you come back, Professor, and then we'll take it from there.
Very good.
And I want to thank you all for watching The Valley View, and come back next week when we have a different program.